name is Karen Halvorsen Schreck, and she's the author of the forthcoming novel Sing for Me, as well as two young adult novels, While He Was Away, a finalist for the Oklahoma Book Award in 2012, and Dream Journal, a 2006 young adult book sense pick. She is also the author of the award-winning children's book Lucy's Family Tree, the recipient of a Pushcart Prize, and an Illinois State's Arts Council grant. Karen received her doctorate in English and creative writing from the University of Illinois at Chicago. She writes and teaches for a living, yay! And she loves visiting schools and other gatherings of readers and writers to talk about her books and the writing process. For more information, you can visit KarenSchreck.com. Karen also had books for sale. Hopefully you bought a bunch on the break, but there'll still maybe be some on the way out. Karen, please come on up.
So nice to be here tonight. Thank you so much. And to be reading with such great writers. It's just been a wonderful evening, so I'm grateful. This is actually the book I'm going to be reading from. It's called Broken Ground, and it came out in May of this year. It's a historical novel. It's set during the 1930s. And I'm going to be reading from chapter 2. So I'll just give you a little bit of background about what's gone before and a hint of what's to come in the novel. It opens in the little oil camp tent house that a newlywed couple, Ruth and Charlie Warren, have built together. They're quite young. Ruth is 21 and he's just a little bit older. And in the first chapter, it's just a kind of, that beautiful early morning waking up experience when you're with someone you love. And they have breakfast, and he goes off to work at his job, which is on an oil rig. The thing that you, I guess, should know is that Ruth, he is her childhood sweetheart, and Ruth, he's also really Ruth's ticket out of an incredibly oppressive family background. So they've moved from this little town in Oklahoma to East Texas. And that's where they're living now. What the book ultimately becomes about is what Ruth does in the wake of tragedy and grief to rebuild her life. I'm not giving anything away to say that Charlie dies at the beginning of the book. It's right here on the back. But she really struggles with depression after that and needs to figure out how to reinvent herself without a lot of support. She ends up, in the time of all the Dust Bowl refugees, going to California, but her experience there is very, very different than you might read about in, say, The Grapes of Wrath. Ultimately, her life intersects with a group of people of Mexican heritage, specifically migrant workers, and she becomes aware of the repatriation program that went on throughout the 30s that was put in place by the Hoover administration. And during that time, between 1 to 2 million people of Mexican heritage were deported and without due process, and 60% of those people were US citizens. So her life collides with the lives of these people. Her suffering collides with their suffering, and that's really where the novel winds up going. So I'll read from chapter 2, and I guess the other thing it might be good to know about Ruth at this point is that her dream, besides escaping her past and being with Charlie, is to be a school teacher. This is the first time I'm reading with my glasses, so there we go. I'm kneeling in a skittering strip of the honey locust tree's shade, scrubbing a pair of Charlie's dungarees on the rub board while his shirts soak in a pot. when I hear the high, thin voice of one of my neighbors. 2 + 2 = 5. I smile down at Charlie's dungarees, the knees worn paper thin. My neighbor knows better. I've taught her better. She's teasing me. Very good, Edna Fay, I tease her back. Surprised silence from behind me. I press my lips together to keep from laughing, then start scrubbing again. Almost these dungarees hold the shape of Charlie. Almost I can feel the curve of his bones when he kneels or bends. 3 + 3 = 7. Excellent. Working at the frayed hems, briskly rubbing left hem against right, I tell Edna Fay that she is the brightest girl for miles around. At that, her bare feet patter against the dirt, and the late morning glare softens. She's standing behind me now, lending her skinny shadow to that of the honey locust. You're not listening, Mrs. Ruth. From what I've seen, Edna Fay has spent most of her 6 years not being listened to by anyone, especially anyone in her family of 9. The one constant in the life of a roustabout child is change, and in the case of Edna Fay's family, constant change has yielded constant chaos. As the middle of the child of the brood, she's particularly lost in the shuffle. Maybe a month ago on Monday, Edna Fay drifted over as I stepped outside. She hungrily eyed the pot I was carrying, seeming to think it might hold soup. It held only hot water and laundry. Still, when I smiled at her, she began prowling the yard in ever-diminishing circles, evaluating the situation. Finally, she sidled up and sat right down on the ground next to me. I asked her what her name was and told her mine, and that was all it took. Edna Fay has barely stopped talking since. 4 + 4 = 9, she says. Her voice breaks with temper or tears, I can't tell which. I can't bear the thought of her unhappy under my watch, so I turn around and take her small, grubby hands in my wet ones. Do you need to review your addition tables? In spite of my best intentions, I sound stuffy and stern, a younger version of my teacher, Mrs. Himmel. But if Mrs. Himmel's methods worked for me, I guess they work for Edna Fay too, at least they do today. She nods solemnly, blinking her round gray eyes. If she weren't so thin, dangerously thin, her belly a taut ball bulging beneath her flour sack shift, her pale face, framed by a milk corona of hair, would resemble nothing so much as a full moon. As it is, the hollows at her cheeks and temples betray a very hungry child. Well then, my voice gentles, let me hang up Mr. Charlie's clean things, and we'll get to work on your math. Edna Fay smiles, exposing the crooked gray nubbins of her teeth. I hang Charlie's dungarees from the clothesline, along with several pairs of socks that have soaked long enough in a bucket of bleach, and on Thursday, mend and sew must be mended and sewn. Then I take Edna Fay's hand and lead her into the house. I set a piece of paper and a pencil on the kitchen table. Addition, the ones. Do odds first and then evens, opposite of usual. I stress this because Edna Fay likes variety, or variety is all that is familiar to her, all she's known over the course of her brief but ever-changing life. Edna Fay bows her head over her work. 1 + 1, she writes carefully on the paper's top line, her tongue working inside her mouth, pushing her cheek to nearly full moon full. I take a pitcher of milk from the icebox and peer down into it. I can spare a cup, at least. I pour milk into an empty canning jar, then cut a slice of bread and spread molasses on thick. I set all this before Edna Fay, and she breathes in deep. Smelling is the next best thing to eating, and she's clearly learned to live on the scent of food alone. The smell of bread, molasses, and milk sustains her through the odds and well into the evens, too. It's a good while before she takes her first bite, her first gulp, and then like that, the plate is empty, the jar drained. She covers her mouth with her hand like I taught her before she burps. Excuse me, she says. I taught her that too. She's still hungry as a bear cub, so I pour more milk. Take it slowly now, I say, and she does her best to obey while I review her sums. Well done, I smile. This time she deserves the compliment. Perfect, in fact. Edna Fay licks the milk mustache from her upper lip. Subtraction now. This is what I like most about Edna Fay. She wants to learn. She needs to. Edna Fay makes a few errors on her 8s and 9s, but really she does a fine job for a child who's only in the last handful of weeks learned methods for making things increase and decrease predictably. As a reward, I invite her into the front room to sit on the sagging sofa that Charlie and I found by the roadside. Here on the sofa, as the sun peaks in the sky, then begins to sink lower, and shirts soak too long in the pot, dungarees and socks dry on the line, and little shadows begin to gather in corners again, which means the minutes truly are ticking toward the time when the mourning dove coos and Charlie returns. I read a tale to Edna Fay from my copy of the Fairy Tales of the Brothers Grimm. We choose Rapunzel, her favorite, and one of mine too. Why do you like this story so much? I asked her once. The tower, Edna Fay answered, as if the greatest joy in any life would be to be locked away alone, all by oneself in a quiet place, with only hair to grow and a guard to deliver regular meals. I like the story for an entirely different reason, the escape. Edna Fay probably would be content if we never got to that part, but I always read on to the happily ever after end. I read on. The sun sinks, the shirts soak, the minutes tick-tock, the shadows gather, deepening, clinging to one another. I turn page after page. It hits me near the happily ever after end. My teaching got the best of me. I neglected to hitch a ride out to Charlie, bearing a jug of cold water and wet towels. It's too late now. I will visit him on the rig tomorrow. I turn another page, listening for the mourning dove. Instead, there's a sound like I've never heard before, a sound like trains colliding. Our little house shifts, the sofa lurches, the windows rattle. The jar from which Edna Fay drank falls from the kitchen table and shatters on the floor. Silence follows the sound. The tornado that hit Alba in 1930 left in its wake such a silence. But this silence stretches even longer. This silence becomes its own kind of terrible noise. Something moves beside me, breaking whatever spell has kept me frozen in place. I look down. Edna Fay. Her gray eyes seem to swallow her hollow moon face. What was that? She asks. I shake my head, and once I start, I can't stop. Shaking my head, I walk to the front door. I open it. Even now, there's not a sound to be heard. No one stands in the silent road. Any birds in the trees, black crows, brown thrashers, blue jays, are stunned dumb. Our mourning dove. I hope she flew far away from here this morning. I tell myself she flew far away. She will return at nighttime when Charlie returns, because Charlie was working in a new field today, a faraway field, a safe field far away. I stand on the porch and watch for him, though it is not yet time for him to come home. In fact, time seems to have stopped, which no doubt will delay him all the longer. I look toward where the sun should be, fixed to a standstill on the horizon, and where the sun should be looms a black cloud of smoke, rising, enormous already and ballooning bigger. I smell it then, burning oil, and something else, something like scorched meat and singed hair. I clap my hands over my nose and mouth to block the smell, to suppress the cry thickening in my throat, and time starts again. Neighbors spill from tents and homes like ours, women and children and men too old to be working or injured men unable to work, who are shouting, "Blowout!" Over and over I hear the word, but no matter how many times I hear it, I can't think what it means. Someone tugs at my dress. I have to find my ma. Edna Faye's high, thin voice is solemn with understanding. I drop to my knees. We are eye to eye, and she is the teacher. What happened? Blow out, she says. Thank you.